when he leaned in close enough that I could feel the heat coming off his body, when his hand came up and pressed flat against the wall beside my head and I realized I was trapped between him and the brick, when his eyes locked on mine and didn't move, I felt something in my chest crack open, something that had been sealed shut. For so long I'd forgotten it existed, and my whole body woke up. In a way it hadn't in decades, in a way I thought was gone forever, and I knew in that moment that everything was about to change. If you're listening, stay with me because I'm about to tell you something I never thought I'd admit out loud, something I've been carrying alone for months now, something that terrifies me and thrills me and makes me question everything I thought I knew about who I am at 56 years old. My name is Rebecca, and until 6 months ago, I was the kind of woman people don't really see anymore. I'd become invisible somewhere along the way. Sometime after my divorce 8 years ago, sometime after my kids grew up and moved out and stopped needing me, sometime after I turned 50 and realized men didn't look at me the same way anymore, didn't look at me at all really, and I'd made peace with that, or at least I thought I had. I'd told myself that part of my life was over, that desire and passion and feeling wanted were things from my past, things I'd had my turn at, and now it was time to focus on other things, my career, my friends, my hobbies, all the things women my age are supposed to fill their lives with when the world decides they're no longer relevant in that particular way. I work at a community arts center in Portland. I manage programs and coordinate classes and work with volunteers, and it's fine. It's meaningful work. I like helping people access art and creativity, but most days I go through the motions feeling like I'm watching my life from outside my body, like I'm performing the role of Rebecca rather than actually being her. I live alone in a small house I bought after the divorce. I have a garden. I tend to obsessively because it gives me something to do with my hands. I see my daughters maybe once a month when they can spare the time. I have dinner with friends every few weeks where we talk about our grandchildren and our health issues and avoid mentioning how lonely we all are. And at night I go home and sit in my living room with a glass of wine and feel the silence pressing in on me until I can't stand it and I turn on the TV just to hear another human voice. I hadn't been touched, really touched, by another person in more than 3 years, not since a brief relationship that fizzled out. Because neither of us could muster enough enthusiasm to keep trying, and I'd stopped missing it after a while, the touch, the intimacy, the feeling of being desired. I'd convinced myself I didn't need those things anymore, that I was beyond that my body was just a vehicle to get me through the rest of my days, and what it looked like or felt like or wanted didn't really matter. I'd stopped looking in mirrors except to check that my hair wasn't a mess and my clothes were appropriate, stopped thinking about my body as anything other than something functional that was slowly breaking down, and I definitely stopped thinking anyone would ever look at my body and want me, in that way again. Ethan started volunteering at the Arts Center in January. He was 23 years old, just out of college, trying to figure out what to do with his life, and someone had told him volunteering might help him gain experience and make connections. So he showed up one Tuesday morning and asked if we needed help with anything. I remember looking at him and thinking he seemed young, painfully young, with that kind of earnest energy young people have before life beats it out of them, and I assigned him to help with the children's art classes, figured he'd be good with kids given how enthusiastic he was about everything. He was tall, maybe 6'2", with dark hair that was always slightly messy and these intense brown eyes that seemed to actually see people when he looked at them. And he had this way of moving that was graceful and confident without being cocky, like he was comfortable in his body in a way I'd never been in mine. For the first few weeks, he was just another volunteer. I'd see him in the hallways, we'd exchange pleasantries, he'd ask questions about how things worked, and I'd answer them. Totally normal, totally professional, nothing that made me think twice. But then one afternoon, I was struggling to hang a heavy piece of artwork in the main gallery, standing on a ladder trying to hold this massive frame while also trying to get the wire onto the hook, and Ethan appeared out of nowhere and said, "Let me help you with that." And he climbed up next to me on the ladder and took the weight of the frame, and our arms brushed, and I felt this jolt go through me, this awareness of his physical presence that I immediately tried to shut down, told myself I was being ridiculous. He was a child, practically. I was old enough to be his mother. This was completely inappropriate. But after that, I started noticing him more, noticing the way he listened when people talked to him, really listened, not just waiting for his turn to speak, noticing how he always asked the kids in his classes about their ideas before, offering suggestions, noticing how he stayed late to help clean up without being asked, noticing how he smiled at me. When we passed in the hallway, this genuine warm smile that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt seen in years. And I started noticing other things too, things I had no business noticing, the way his forearms looked, when he rolled up his sleeves, the way his jeans fit, the way his voice got deeper when he was concentrating on something, and I felt ashamed of noticing these things, felt like a creepy old woman who should know better, should be above this kind of base physical attraction to someone young enough to be my son. One day in late February, we ended up alone in the supply room together, both reaching for the same box of art supplies on a high shelf, and we laughed awkwardly, and he said, "Here, let me get that," and he reached up and got the box and handed it to me, and our fingers touched, and there was this moment, this suspended moment, where we just looked at each other and something passed between us, something electric and terrifying. And I pulled back quickly and mumbled thank you and practically ran out of the room, my heart pounding, my face hot, feeling like a teenager who'd just had her first crush. Except I wasn't a teenager, I was 56 years old, and this was insane. I started avoiding him after that, or trying to, would assign him tasks that kept him in different parts of the building from where I was working, would take a different route through the center so I wouldn't have to pass him in the hallway, but it was impossible to avoid him completely, and every time I did see him I felt this pull, this magnetic pull toward him that I couldn't explain and didn't want to examine. He started seeking me out, asking my opinion on things, wanting to show me projects the kids had made, sitting with me during lunch breaks, even though there were plenty of younger volunteers he could have been socializing with, and I couldn't tell if he was just being friendly, or if there was something else happening, something I was too scared to acknowledge. It was March when everything shifted. We were setting up for a community art show, and it was late, after 8. Most people had already left, but Ethan and I were still there finishing up, and I was exhausted. My back hurt from lifting frames all day, and I must have made a sound of pain because Ethan was suddenly right behind me saying, "Are you okay?" And before I could answer, his hands were on my shoulders, pressing gently into the tight muscles there. And I should have pulled away, should have told him to stop, but I didn't. I just stood there, frozen as his hands worked the tension out of my shoulders, and I felt myself melting under his touch, felt my body responding in ways I'd thought it had forgotten how to respond. His hands were warm and strong and careful, and he was standing so close I could feel his breath on the back of my neck, and I closed my eyes and for just a moment let myself have this, let myself feel what it was like to be touched, with intention, with care, with something that felt an awful lot like desire. Then he said softly, almost in my ear, "You work too hard. You should take better care of yourself." And the intimacy of his voice, the concern in it, broke whatever spell I'd been under, and I stepped forward away from him and said, "Thank you, I'm fine. We should finish up here." And I didn't look at him because I knew if I looked at him, I'd see something in his eyes that I couldn't handle seeing. We worked in silence for the next hour, this charged, uncomfortable silence, and when we were finally done and walking out to the parking lot together, both of us the last ones there, he stopped next to my car and said, "Rebecca, can I ask you something?" And I said, "Sure," trying to sound casual, trying to pretend my heart wasn't racing. And he said, "Do you feel it too, this thing between us? Or am I crazy? Am I imagining it?" And I stood there under the parking lot lights feeling exposed and terrified, and I wanted to lie, wanted to tell him he was imagining it, there was nothing between us, but I couldn't make the words come out, couldn't lie to him when he was looking at me with such honest vulnerability. And finally I said, "Ethan, you, RE 23 years old, I'm 56, whatever you think you're feeling, it's not real, it can't be real." He stepped closer and said, Why can't it be real? Age is just a number. It doesn't change the fact that I think about you constantly, that I look forward to coming here every day just so I can see you, that every conversation we have matters to me in a way conversations with people my own age don't seem to. I was shaking my head, backing up against my car, and I said, "This is insane. I'm old enough to be your mother. People would judge us, judge you, think I was taking advantage of you, think I was desperate or predatory or pathetic." And he said, "I don't care what people think. I care about what I feel, and what I feel when I'm around you is more alive than I've felt in my entire life." I told him he needed to stop, told him this couldn't happen, told him to forget. We'd had this conversation, and I got in my car and drove home shaking so hard I could barely hold the steering wheel. And when I got inside, I poured myself a large glass of wine and sat on my couch and cried. Cried for all the years I'd spent feeling invisible. Cried for the impossible situation I'd just found myself in. Cried because some part of me, some part I didn't want to acknowledge, wanted to say yes to him, wanted to let myself feel what he was offering, wanted to be alive again in the way he seemed to think I could be. I didn't go to work the next day, called in sick, spent the day in my garden pulling weeds and trying not to think about the look in Ethan's eyes when he'd asked if I felt it too, trying not to think about how my body had responded to his hands on my shoulders, trying not to think about how long it had been since anyone had looked at me the way he looked at me, like I was someone worth seeing, worth wanting. My daughter Claire called that afternoon and asked how I was doing, and I almost told her, almost said, "There's this young man who says he has feelings for me and I don't know what to do." But I couldn't. That bear the judgment I knew would come, the concern, the suggestion that maybe I should talk to a therapist about why I was having these inappropriate feelings. So I said, "I'm fine, honey, just busy with work." And we talked about her life, her kids, her problems, and I listened and gave advice and played the role of mother like I always did. I went back to work 2 days later, determined to maintain professional boundaries, to pretend the parking lot conversation had never happened. But the moment I walked into the building, Ethan was there waiting by my office, and he said, "We need to talk." And I said, "There's nothing to talk about." And he said, "Please, just give me 5 minutes." And something in his face, something raw and pleading, made me nod and unlock my office door and let him in. He closed the door behind us and said, "I can't stop thinking about what you said, about how people would judge us. And you're right, they would, but Rebecca, I don't care. I've never felt about anyone the way I feel about you. And I've tried to talk myself out of it, tried to tell myself it's just a crush or I'm projecting something onto you, but it's not, it's real, you're real, and I think you feel it too, even if you're too scared to admit it." I sat down at my desk and put my head in my hands and said, "Ethan, even if I did feel something, which I'm not saying I do, this couldn't work. There are so many reasons why this couldn't work, the age difference alone." And he interrupted me and said, "Why does the age difference matter so much to you? You're beautiful and intelligent and interesting, and I don't care that you're older than me. That makes you more interesting, not less. You've lived a life. You have depth. You not like the girls my age who are still figuring out who they are." I looked up at him and said, "Girls your age are figuring out who they are. You should be with someone who's doing that journey with you, not someone who's already done it, someone who's tired and settled and past all that." And he said, "You're not past anything. You're just scared. You've convinced yourself you're done with that part of life. But you're not. I can see it in your eyes every time you look at me. You want this as much as I do." He moved closer, came around to my side of the desk, and I stood up instinctively, backing up until I hit the wall. And he followed, stopping just close enough that I could feel the space between us humming with tension, and he said, "Tell me you don't feel anything and I'll leave you alone. I'll keep volunteering here, but I'll stay away from you. I'll respect your boundaries. Just tell me honestly that you don't feel what I feel and I'll believe you." I opened my mouth to say the words, to tell him I didn't feel anything. But I couldn't. Couldn't lie when he was looking at me like that, when my body was betraying me by leaning toward him, when every cell in me was screaming to close the distance between us. And instead of speaking, I just stood there, frozen. And he took that as the answer it was. He lifted his hand slowly, giving me time to pull away, and placed it on the wall beside my head. And then he leaned in close, so close I could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, could feel his breath on my face, could smell whatever soap or cologne he wore, and he said, "I'm going to kiss you now unless you tell me to stop," and I knew I should tell him to stop. Knew this was crossing a line we couldn't uncross, but I didn't. Say anything, didn't move, and when his lips touched mine I felt my entire body light up like I'd been shocked, felt years of numbness and disconnection fall away in an instant, felt myself kissing him back with a hunger I didn't know I still had in me. It lasted maybe 10 seconds before reality crashed back in, and I pushed him away, not hard but firmly, and said, "We can't do this. This is crazy. This is my office. Someone could walk in, we could get caught," and he was breathing hard, and he said then, "Not here. Come to my apartment tonight, please. I just want to talk to you away from this place, away from all the reasons you think this is wrong." And I said, "I can." And he said, "Yes, you can. You're choosing not to. There's a difference." And he wrote his address on a post-it note and put it on my desk and said, "I'll be there all evening. If you come, you come. If you don't, I'll understand." And then he left. I spent the rest of the day in a daze, couldn't focus on any task, kept touching my lips where he'd kissed me, kept replaying the moment over and over, the feel of his mouth on mine, the way my body had responded, the way time had seemed to stop. Part of me was horrified at what I'd done, at how easily I'd let it happen, at how much I wanted it to happen again, and part of me felt more alive than I had in decades, felt like I'd been sleepwalking through my life and had suddenly woken up. I kept looking at that post-it note with his address, kept telling myself, I wasn't going to go, this was insane, I was too old for this, he was too young, it was inappropriate, and probably damaging to him, and definitely damaging to my professional reputation if anyone found out. I left work at 5 and drove home and made dinner and tried to watch TV, and all I could think about was Ethan waiting in his apartment, wondering if I'd come, and at 7:30 I found myself getting in my car, telling myself I was just going to drive by, just going to see where he lived. I wasn't actually going to go in. But when I got to his building, I parked and sat there for 20 minutes arguing with myself, and finally I got out of the car and walked up to his door and knocked before I could change my mind. He answered immediately, like he'd been waiting right by the door, and the look of relief and joy on his face when he saw me almost broke me, and he said, "You came. I didn't think you would come." And I said, "I don't know why I'm here. I don't know what I'm doing. This is a mistake." And he said, "It's not a mistake. Come in, please." And I walked into his small studio apartment, neat and sparse with just a bed and a desk and a bookshelf, and I stood in the middle of the room feeling more nervous than I could remember feeling in years. He offered me tea, and I said yes because I needed something to do with my hands, needed a reason not to look at him directly, and we sat on his bed because there was nowhere else to sit, and he said, "I'm glad you came. I've been going crazy thinking about that kiss, thinking about you." And I said, "Ethan, we need to talk about what this is, what you think this could be, because I need you to understand that I'm not young anymore. My body isn't what it used to be. I have stretch marks and wrinkles, and everything is starting to sag. And you're this beautiful young man who could have anyone your own age who doesn't come with all my baggage and complications." He set down his tea and turned to face me and said, "Rebecca, do you want to know what I see when I look at you? I see someone who's lived, who's experienced things, who has depths and layers. I see your smile and the way you light up when you talk about art. I see how kind you are to everyone, even when they don't deserve it. I see your hands and think about all the things they've created. I see your eyes and think about everything they've witnessed. And yes, I see your body. I see a woman's body, a real body that shows she's lived in it, and that's so much more beautiful to me than some girl my age who's never experienced anything." I felt tears starting, and I said, "You don't understand what you're saying. You don't understand what you'd be giving up, the judgment you'd face, the comments people would make about you being with someone my age. They'd assume you had mommy issues, or I was paying you, or something equally horrible." And he said, "I don't care what they think. The only thing I care about is what you think, whether you want this, whether you want me." I looked at him and said, "Honestly, I don't know what I want. I've spent so long not wanting anything, not letting myself want anything, that I don't know how to do this anymore, don't know how to let someone in, especially someone like you who deserves so much more than what I can offer. He reached over and took my hand, just held it, and said, "What if you stopped thinking about what I deserve and started thinking about what you deserve? What if you let yourself have something good just because it feels good, not because it makes sense or because other people approve or because it fits into some narrative about what 56-year-old women are supposed to want?" And I realized he was right. Realized I'd spent so much of my life doing what was expected, being the good wife, the good mother, the good employee, always putting other people's needs and opinions ahead of my own desires, and where had that gotten me? Divorced and lonely, and convinced I was done with desire altogether. I turned to him and said, "If we do this, if we try this, it has to stay private. I can't have people at work knowing, can't have my daughters finding out, not yet. Maybe not ever. I need you to understand that this has to be our secret." And he said, "I understand. I don't care about telling people. I just care about being with you." And I said, "Okay." And he said, "Okay." And then he kissed me again, slower. This time, deeper. And I let myself feel it, let myself sink into it, let myself forget for a moment about age and appropriateness and judgment and just be present in the sensation of being wanted, being kissed, being touched like I mattered. We didn't sleep together that night. We just kissed and talked and kissed. Some more, and he held me like I was something precious, and I left. Around midnight, feeling dazed and terrified and more alive than I'd felt in decades. And when I got home, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror and really looked at myself for the first time in years, tried to see what he saw, and I couldn't quite see it, but I wanted to believe that I could be desirable again, that my body and my face and my life could be enough for someone, especially someone like him. We fell into a pattern over the next weeks. I'd go to his apartment a few nights a week after work. We'd order takeout and watch movies and talk about everything, our lives, our dreams, our fears, and slowly, carefully, we started exploring each other physically. And every time he touched me, I felt like I was discovering my body for the first time, like I'd been living in it all these years without really inhabiting it. He was patient and attentive and curious, wanted to know what I liked, what felt good, and I had to relearn how to answer those questions, had to give myself permission to have preferences, to ask for what I wanted, to be a sexual being again, instead of just someone who'd resigned herself to being done with all that. The first time we actually slept together, I cried afterward, not sad tears, but overwhelmed tears, tears of release and relief and disbelief, that this was really happening, that this beautiful young man was really here with me, choosing me, seeing me, making me feel things I thought I'd never feel again. And he held me and said, "It's okay, you're okay, I've got you." And I believed him, believed that he had me, believed that maybe this wasn't just some temporary insanity, but something real, something that could sustain us both. But of course, we couldn't keep it secret forever. People started noticing things, noticing how Ethan and I looked at each other when we thought no one was watching, noticing how he always volunteered for projects I was leading, noticing how we'd both arrive at work at the same time, sometimes when we'd actually spent the night together and drove in together but parked separately to maintain the illusion. Sarah, one of the other staff members, pulled me aside one day and said, "Is there something going on between you and Ethan?" And I felt my face go hot and said, "No, of course not. Why would you think that?" And she said, "I don't know, there's just this vibe between you two." And I said, "There's no vibe. He's just a dedicated volunteer." And she looked at me like she didn't believe me but didn't push it. My daughter Emma, the quiet one, the one who notices everything but rarely says anything, came to visit in May, and we went out to lunch, and she said, "Mom, you seem different. Happier, maybe. What's going on with you?" And I said, "Nothing. Just work is going well." And she said, "No, it's something else. You're glowing. Are you seeing someone?" And I almost told her, almost said, "Yes, I'm seeing someone. He's wonderful and he makes me feel alive." But I couldn't risk her judgment or her concern or her telling her sister. So I said, "No, I'm not seeing anyone. Just been taking better care of myself." And she nodded, but I could tell she didn't quite believe me either. Ethan and I had been together for 3 months when the incident happened that changed everything. We'd gotten careless, comfortable, stopped being as careful about hiding. And one evening after the art center had closed, we were in the supply room. He'd come up behind me while I was counting inventory and wrapped his arms around my waist and kissed my neck. And I turned around and kissed him properly, and we were so lost in each other that we didn't hear the door open, didn't hear footsteps, didn't realize anyone was there until we heard a gasp and pulled apart to see Margaret, the art center director, standing in the doorway with her mouth open. The silence that followed was excruciating. Margaret just stood there staring at us, and I felt my entire body go cold. Felt shame wash over me so intensely I thought I might be sick, and I tried to stammer out some explanation, but nothing coherent came out. And finally Margaret said, "Rebecca, Ethan, my office, now." We followed her like children being sent to the principal's office, and she closed the door and said, "What on earth is going on here?" And I said, "Margaret, I can explain." And she held up her hand and said, "I don't want to hear it right now. I need time to think about this. About what this means. Ethan, you should go home. Rebecca, you and I will talk tomorrow." Ethan left after squeezing my hand briefly, and I drove home in a panic, convinced I was going to lose my job, convinced everyone would know by tomorrow, convinced this was the disaster I'd known all along was coming. I didn't sleep that night, just lay in bed replaying the look on Margaret's face, the disgust or shock or whatever it was, and wondering how I'd let this happen, how I'd let myself get caught, how I'd been stupid enough to think we could keep this secret forever. The next morning, Margaret called me into her office before the center opened, and she said, "Rebecca, I've been thinking about this all night. I've known you for 7 years, and I've never seen you act unprofessionally before, so I need you to help me understand what's happening here. Is Ethan pressuring you in any way? Because if he is, that's a serious issue." And I was so surprised by the question it took me a moment to respond. And then I said, "No, God, no, it's not like that. If anything, I'm the one who should be worried about. I'm in a position of authority. I'm older. I should have known better." And she said, "So this is consensual. This is something you both want." And I said, "Yes, it is." And she sat back and said, Okay, I needed to know that." She was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, "Rebecca, I'm going to be honest with you. If this were any other volunteer and any other staff member, I would probably have to report this, have to create some distance. But I've watched Ethan over these past months, and I've seen how dedicated he is, how professional he is with everyone else, and I've watched you too. And I've seen you come alive in a way I haven't seen since I've known you." And she paused and said, "My sister is married to a man 15 years younger than her. They've been together 20 years, and everyone judged them at first, but they're the happiest couple I know, so I'm not going to judge you, but I need you both to be more careful. What you do outside of work is your business, but at work you need to maintain professional boundaries. Can you do that?" I nodded, too stunned to speak, and she said, "Good. Now let's not speak of this again unless we have to." And I left her office, feeling like I'd been given a reprieve I didn't deserve, feeling grateful and shocked and relieved beyond measure. I texted Ethan what had happened, and he called me immediately, said I was so worried. "I thought she was going to fire you." And I said I thought so too, and he said I would have quit if she had, would have walked away from this place if it meant protecting you, and I said I wouldn't have let you do that. Your volunteering is important for your career, and he said, "You're more important than my career." And hearing him say that made me realize how much this had become, how much we'd become, how impossible it would be to walk away from him now, even if I wanted to. We were more careful after that, kept things strictly professional at work, saved all our intimacy for his apartment, or occasionally my house when I felt brave enough to have him over, and life settled into this strange double existence where at work I was Rebecca, the program manager, professional and competent and invisible, and in private I was Rebecca, the woman, desired and alive and rediscovering who I was underneath all the roles I'd been playing for decades. Ethan taught me things about myself I'd forgotten or never known, taught me that my body still had the capacity for pleasure, that my mind still had the capacity for passion, that my Heart still had the capacity for love, because yes, somewhere along the way I had fallen in love with him, this 23-year-old man who saw me more clearly than anyone ever had. I told him I loved him one night in July. We were lying in his bed after making love, and he was tracing patterns on my arm with his finger, and I said, "You know, I love you, right?" And he stopped moving and said, "You've never said that before." And I said, "I know. I was scared it would make everything too real, too complicated, but it's already real, already complicated, and I love you." And he rolled over to face me and said, "I love you too. I've loved you since that day you helped me hang that artwork, I think. Or maybe since the first day I met you," and we both laughed at how impossible and ridiculous and absolutely real this was. My daughter Claire found out in August. She showed up at my house unexpectedly one evening, and Ethan was there. We'd just finished dinner, and she walked in using the key I'd given her years ago and found us sitting on the couch together, not doing anything inappropriate but sitting closer than friends would sit, and she froze and said, "Mom, who is this?" And I stood up too quickly and said, "This is Ethan. He volunteers at the arts center." And Claire looked between us and said, "Okay, is he also your boyfriend? Because the way you were sitting," and I didn't know what to say, couldn't lie to her face. And finally I nodded and said, "Yes, we're seeing each other." And she said, "Mom, he's like half your age." And Ethan said, "Actually, I'm a third her age." And I shot him a look that said, "Not helping." And Claire said, "I need to talk to you alone." Ethan left, and Claire and I sat at my kitchen table, and she said, "Mom, what are you doing? What are you thinking? Do you know how this looks?" And I said, "I know how it looks. I know everyone will judge, but Claire, I'm happy. For the first time in years, I'm actually happy." And she said, "But he's 23. What could you possibly have in common?" And I said, "More than you'd think. He's mature for his age. He's been through things, and besides, shared experience isn't what makes a relationship. Work connection is, and we have that. We have real connection." She was quiet for a long time, and then she said, "Are you sure he's not using you, taking advantage of your money or your position?" And I said, "I'm sure. He's never asked me for anything. He pays for things, even though he can barely afford it. He works hard. He's building his own life. He just wants to share it with me." And she said, "But Mom, what happens when he wants kids? When he wants someone who can give him a future? You're 56, and I felt that cut deep, felt the truth of it, the fear I carried constantly that eventually Ethan would realize what he was giving up by being with me." But I said, "I know. I've thought about that. We've talked about it. He says he doesn't want kids, doesn't need that future, but if he changes his mind, then I'll let him go. I won't hold him back from what he needs, but right now, this is what we both need." Claire left that night still unhappy about the situation, but at least not actively hostile. And a few days later she called and said, "I told Emma. She's worried too, but we talked and we decided that you're an adult, and you can make your own choices. We don't have to understand them. We just have to accept them, and if he makes you happy, then we'll try to be okay with it." I cried after that call, cried with relief that I wouldn't lose my daughters over this, that they loved me enough to try to accept something they didn't understand. And when I told Ethan, he said, "See, the people who really love you will come around." And I said, "Not everyone will. There will still be judgment. There will still be people who think I'm pathetic or predatory or having some kind of crisis." And he said, "Then those people don't to matter. The only people who matter are the ones who take the time to know us, to see what we have, and everyone else can think whatever they want." By fall, I'd stopped caring quite so much what people thought, stopped trying to hide what Ethan and I had become to each other, started being more open about our relationship with friends and colleagues. And yes, some people were weird about it. Some people made comments or gave me looks or just stopped talking to me altogether. But more people than I expected were supportive, or at least neutral, and I realized that my fear of judgment had been worse than the actual judgment, that I'd been so convinced everyone would condemn me that I hadn't considered some people might understand, might even be happy for me. Patricia, one of my oldest friends, took me to lunch when she heard and said, "Rebecca, I'm going to be honest, when I first heard you were dating someone that young, I thought you'd lost your mind, but then I saw you two together at that gallery opening last week, and the way he looks at you, the way you look at him, that's real. That's the kind of connection people spend their whole lives looking for, and I'd be a hypocrite to judge you for finding it just because the packaging isn't conventional. And she said you seem like yourself again. Like the woman I met 20 years ago before life wore you down. And I want that for you. I want you to be happy. Ethan and I have been together for 9 months now, and I know we're not past the honeymoon phase. I know there will be challenges ahead, conversations we still need to have about futures and expectations and what happens when the novelty wears off. But right now, I'm trying to just be present. In this, trying to let myself have this happiness without constantly waiting for it to end. He's moving into my house next month. We've been spending almost every night together anyway, and his lease is up, and it makes sense. And yes, I'm terrified of what that means. Of making things even more real. Of what it will look like to my daughters and neighbors and colleagues to have this young man living with me. But I'm also excited. Excited to wake up next to him every morning, to build a life together, to see where this goes. My body has changed over these 9 months. I stand differently now, move differently. I look at myself in mirrors again, and instead of seeing all the flaws and evidence of aging, I see a woman who's desired, who's living, who's taking up space in the world. Instead of trying to disappear into the background, and I know I have Ethan to thank for that, for seeing me when I'd become invisible, for wanting me when I thought I was past being wanted, for making me feel at 56 like I'm just beginning instead of ending. I know what people see when they look at us. They see a desperate older woman clinging to her youth through a relationship with a much younger man, or they see a young man with issues, taking advantage of a lonely woman's vulnerability, and maybe both those things are partially true. Maybe I am trying to hold on to something. Maybe he does have unresolved things. That drew him to someone older, but what they don't see is the way we talk for hours about everything and nothing. The way he listens to my stories about my past without judgment, the way I support his dreams for his future without trying to control them, the way we've created this space where both of us can be fully ourselves without pretense or performance. What they don't see is how he'll stop what he's doing when I come into a room just to look at me, how he notices when I'm tired or stressed and makes me tea without asking, how he touches me like I'm something precious, even though I've told him 100 times about all my imperfections. And what they don't see is how I encourage him to spend time with friends his own age, how I never try to make him feel guilty for wanting things I can't give him, how I'm constantly checking in to make sure he's not sacrificing too much by being with me. And what they definitely don't see is how we've both grown from this, how I've become braver and more alive, and he's become more grounded and sure of himself, how we've made each other better in ways that have nothing to do with age and everything to do with genuine care and connection. I don't know how long this will last. I don't know if we'll make it a year or 5 years or forever. I don't know what will happen when the outside pressure gets too intense, or when he meets someone his own age who doesn't come with all my complications, or when I get sick, or too old to keep up with him, or when any of the 1,000 other obstacles that could destroy us actually do. But what I know is that right now, in this moment, I am alive in a way I haven't been in decades. I am seen and known and desired, and I'm not going to apologize for that, not going to diminish it or hide it or pretend it's something other than what it is, which is love, messy and inconvenient and age inappropriate and absolutely real love. Ethan told me something a few weeks ago that I keep coming back to. We were having one of our late night conversations, and I was spiraling about age again, about how I'm going to get older and more decrepit, and eventually he'll realize what he's signed up for. And he took my face in his hands and said, "Rebecca, everyone gets old, everyone's body breaks down, everyone becomes difficult to care for eventually. That's not unique to you. The only question that matters is, who do you want beside you when that happens? Who do you trust to still see you, still love you, still choose you when it gets hard? And I choose you. I will always choose you. And I want to be the person you choose too." And I realized he was right, that my fear wasn't really about age. It was about being abandoned, about being left again like I was left before. and he was offering me something. I'd been too scared to accept, which was the promise that he wouldn't leave, that he'd stay, that I was worth staying for. So I'm choosing to believe him, choosing to trust this, choosing to let myself be fully present in this relationship instead of constantly bracing for it to end. And that's the hardest thing I've ever done. Harder than my divorce, harder than raising kids alone, harder than building a career. Because it requires a vulnerability I thought I'd lost the capacity for, requires me to show up every day with my heart completely undefended and trust that he'll be careful with it. And some days I'm terrified, and some days I'm gloriously happy, and most days I'm both. But what I am, every single day, is alive, truly deeply alive. And I finally understand that this feeling is what I'd been missing all those years. This is what it means to really live instead of just survive. And I have a 23-year-old man to thank for teaching a 56-year-old woman how to feel alive again in ways she'd forgotten were even possible.